Okay, I'd like to now move into the next area where I want to talk about how cells use energy to maintain order. Okay, let's begin with this first law of thermodynamics. And we can define this law as energy is neither created nor destroyed. However, energy can be converted from one form to another. So let's think of an example here. You can have solar energy coming in from the sun. It can be converted, again, it's not being created or destroyed here, but it can be converted into chemical bond energy. We'll talk about photosynthesis in a little bit, but the energy from the sun can produce, say, a sugar molecule like glucose. And the bonds in this molecule here have a lot of chemical energy associated with them. So this is a pretty good example of how the first law of thermodynamics is fulfilled. As a second example, we can take this chemical bond energy and it can be broken down to form heat energy. Again, we didn't create or destroy any of the energy, we just converted it to a different form. This heat energy can now be used to maintain order in the cell. So this is the first law of thermodynamics. As a consequence of this first law of thermodynamics, the total amount of energy in the universe must always be the same. Okay, so that ends the first law of thermodynamics for now. We'll come back to it later. Okay, let's go ahead now and talk about the second law of thermodynamics. This law states that disorder in the universe can only increase. In talking about the second law of thermodynamics, I think it's important to mention entropy. And entropy is the measure of a system's disorder. So another way we could state the second law of thermodynamics is to say that entropy in the universe can only increase. This law has an implication to organisms. If you look at a living organism, such as a flower, or maybe the wings of a butterfly, or the spines of a sea urchin, these are all highly ordered structures. It takes a lot of energy and work to maintain that structure, that order. So the implication to these organisms is this law would suggest that organisms must also increase in disorder. But that's not what we see. We see an increase in order. So how does this not violate this law? Your book gives a pretty good example of this outside of the context of a cell. So let's talk about that as an example. Your book shows a picture of a neat and organized room. And if you've ever seen a neat and organized room, if you've ever been to my office, you might think I've never seen a neat and organized room. But there are times when my office is neat and organized, or at the very least, a little neat and a little organized. But it doesn't really take much for my office to become an unorganized mess. This process of going from neat and organized to a mess is spontaneous. I promise you, I put no energy or effort into creating a messy office. It is spontaneous. This unorganized, messy room here has greater entropy. Let's see, I'll write that here. Greater entropy. It has more disorder. Though you may not believe it, there are times when I put a little bit of energy into cleaning my office. This takes energy. It takes a lot of energy to go from an unorganized, messy room to a neat and organized room. So since we need to add energy to it, it is not spontaneous. I wish it was, but it is not. It is not spontaneous. So having this localized increase in order doesn't violate this second law of thermodynamics, because it's important to point out that it says that there has to be an increase in disorder in the universe. The energy that is used to decrease disorder or to make entropy less is balanced by greater disorder in the universe. So down here I'm going to write local increase in order is offset by greater disorder in the universe. So these local changes here are offset by all the disorder that is in the entire universe, because that is what the law defines, the universe. So this may provide a nice overall example, but this is a cell biology class. So let's think about how increasing order in a cell does not violate this law. So let me draw a cell. And inside this cell, there are lots of molecules. And these molecules exist in a disordered manner. They're moving in different directions, random directions. They are disordered. We know that within a cell, though, we're going to have increased order. So let's draw this cell here. And some of these molecules have created a larger molecule. In the process of this order here, establishing this order, we've generated heat. This extra heat that has been generated causes these other molecules, we'll draw them around here, to become even more disordered, because this heat has raised the temperature, and so maybe they're not only going in random directions, but they're bouncing all over the place because of this heat that has been released by creating some order here. So the order here that has been generated is actually decreasing entropy. It's creating order. But it doesn't violate this law, because in the process of creating this order, it's increased the overall disorder in this cell, in this localized environment, what we called the universe on the previous picture. Decreases in entropy because of the order here in this localized region is offset by the overall increase in entropy or disorder in the entire environment. Because of these two interplaying with each other as such, the second law of thermodynamics is not violated in a cell where there is increased order. Okay, I'm going to now spend a little bit of time talking about photosynthesis. And we're going to come back to photosynthesis later in the semester. But I'm going to talk about photosynthesis and oxidation of organic molecules, or respiration. I want to talk about a couple observations here. So when animals eat food, first they get energy from the chemical bonds found in that food, and the animals also get atoms that they'll use as they build new structures in their cells. So they get these two things from the food they eat. So animals get energy from the food they eat. Okay, what about the plants? They also get energy from chemical bonds. But they don't get it from eating food. They get it because they make it from solar energy. Now, in an interesting way, since animals either eat plants or animals eat animals that ate the plants, all the energy that animals get ultimately come from the plants. And if you go back far enough, ultimately the sun from the solar energy is what provides animals the energy they need and the atoms they need. So we're all dependent on this big sun. So I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about photosynthesis. Because we mentioned that animals and plants rely upon solar energy from the sun. And this solar energy is fed into the plants into the first stage of photosynthesis. So stage 1. In stage 1, what happens is that energy from the sun is harvested. So we're going to write harvest energy. In this process, oxygen is made and water is fed into the system. And importantly, heat is released. And we'll talk about this in greater detail later, but now there are energy carriers that move that energy into the second stage of photosynthesis. This stage fixes carbon. And we'll talk in more detail about that later. But in the process of fixing the carbon, sugars are generated. These sugars are then used by the plant or the animals that eat the plants for their chemical energy. So the sugars are used for their chemical energy. In this process, CO2 is fed into stage 2 of photosynthesis. It's this carbon that is used to get fixed and to make these sugars, and also water. Also, not surprisingly, heat is lost. So we can think of this as harvesting the energy and then fixing the carbon. The end goal, or the end result, is that you create oxygen and sugars. These oxygens and sugars can now be fed into respiration, cellular respiration. Alright, so during cellular respiration, the sugars and the oxygen obtained from photosynthesis are used. So the sugars here are oxidized to generate energy for the cell. That energy in the cell then can be used to do all those very cellular works that we talked about at the very beginning of this set of podcasts. In this process, CO2 is generated and water is generated. CO2 ultimately will go back and function during stage 2 of photosynthesis, and water goes back and works in both stage 1 and stage 2. So the two are connected in this way. And even though we're generating significant order in this process, particularly the process of photosynthesis, that's offset by the amount of heat that is being generated and the disorder that that heat is producing. Photosynthesis, I asked, where does this occur? In which kinds of organisms? And we know that photosynthesis occurs in plants, some algae, and cyanobacteria. Cellular respiration occurs in all aerobic organisms, including animals, plants, bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoa. I now want to move into this last section for these podcasts, and I want to discuss the possibility that a reaction will occur. We know that as entropy increases, we move towards disorder, and we know that's spontaneous. However, we can't measure entropy because you cannot measure disorder in the system and the universe simultaneously. However, we can measure this term that we call free energy, and we can measure the change in free energy. And we can measure this using the equilibrium constant, which we're not going to talk about quite yet, or by the concentration of the reactants and the concentration of the products. Free energy change. It's an important point, I think. Is the most important means to determine thermodynamic spontaneity. That is whether a reaction will go, whether or not the reaction is spontaneous. If we can measure the change in free energy, we can answer whether or not that reaction will be spontaneous. So let's talk about free energy change. And this is referred to as delta G. So how do we use this free energy change? Let's first talk about an exergonic reaction. Exergonic reactions are energetically favorable. We could also say they're spontaneous. An exergonic reaction like this will have reactants with a greater free energy compared to the product. The product will have a lower free energy. If that's the case, if the reactants have a greater free energy compared to the products with a lower free energy, then this reaction is exergonic, or energetically favorable, or we could say spontaneous. And to bring back our laws of thermodynamics, we would say this reaction increases disorder. Okay, let's counter that with our good friend, the Endergonic reaction. These are energetically unfavorable, or we could say they are not spontaneous. In this case, the reactants have a lower free energy compared to the products, which have a greater free energy. In this case, it would be an endergonic reaction. This process here would increase order. The only way this reaction could occur if it was coupled with another reaction that was energetically favored. So exergonic reactions can help these endergonic reactions move forward. I also want to say one more thing here. It was implied, but I didn't specifically state. In these exergonic reactions, this delta G is less than 0. In these endergonic reactions, delta G, the change in free energy, is greater than 0. Alright, that's all I have to say for this group of podcasts, and I'd like to close with a quick summary. We began talking about some basic definitions. We defined energy, work, metabolism. Within metabolism, we talked about anabolic and catabolic pathways. We talked about the importance of enzymes. So we kind of set the stage and talked about some basic terms here. We then moved into talking about how cells use energy. And in this process, we talked about the first and the second laws of thermodynamics. How energy is neither created or destroyed, but can be transferred to a different type of energy.